This is episode 493 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined for this show by Todd Myers. Todd is speaking at an event this week here in Albuquerque, put on by the Rio Grande Foundation, a luncheon talk that Todd is going to give. And Todd, we've known each other for a long time, but welcome back to New Mexico.
Yeah, it's been too long, so I'm really happy to be back here.
Yeah, now I'm not going to give all of your biographical information out. I'll hit a few of the highlights, which is you handle environmental policy at the Washington Policy Center state think tank out in Washington, the state, that is, of course.
Yep.
And we worked together, I don't remember how long ago, but you did some work on LEED and other kinds of standards for environmental design and building.
Yeah, green building
schools.
standards.
Yeah. And now you have a new book, but it's not your first book. How many books have you written?
This is just my second.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't remember if we had you on the first time around. When did you publish Eco Fads?
So just over a decade ago. So
okay,
I'm spacing myself out.
Yeah, that's okay. Hey, I've never published a book myself, so you're doing fine. But you have time to think small. I'm gonna hold this up for the camera if you're watching. If you're not watching, it is time to think small. It is about how Nimble environmental technologies can solve environmental problems here in presumably the United States, but also around the world. And so what's the thesis here of your book? What's driving you to write this particular book at this time?
Well, it's funny because actually my first book, Eco Fads, I talked about how environmental policy is based too much around fads, sort of things that feel good but don't actually help the planet. And the green building stuff that we did is a perfect example. So Albuquerque school district wanted to build a bunch of school buildings to these green building standards. And then when we looked at them, we actually found that the green buildings used more energy per square foot than the non-green schools. And when I talk with facilities directors in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and then across the United States, what they would usually say is, yes, the school board wants to look good. The school board wants to be able to have a plaque on the wall. We've tried to tell them that these buildings don't actually save energy, but they want to feel good. And so that was what my first book is about. What this book is about is how we move beyond that. So the problem, I think one of the big problems of environmentalism is that it has become so polarized that for people on the center right, when you talk about the environment, they sort of get this shiver up their spine because it has become associated with big government solutions. So even in their daily lives, they do things that show they care about the environment, right? They're hikers, they're hunters, they are fishers. If you look at a map of where sort of the red parts of the country, it's where the nature is. So, but the rhetoric doesn't sound like that because environmentalism has become so politicized, this thing that I wrote about in my first book. So how do you deal with that? And the way that you deal with that is that you tie people directly to results, to the incentives where they have an incentive to do things that actually work. And when they don't, they have the accountability to change rather than do the sort of political thing, which is, no, everything's good. I'm a great environmental hero, even though green schools don't save energy, even though the policies that I'm pushing don't actually have the outcomes that I pretend. So that's what my book is about how small technologies, just over the last decade, have empowered people to do things they never could before so that we don't have to rely on politicians whose incentives are not to help the environment, but to help themselves.
Now, you talk about how kind of the environment has become in many ways, or at least in the center-right viewpoint, a proxy for socialism, the idea of watermelons, and green on the outside, red on the inside. Of course, Greta Thunberg kind of announced that this was her perspective as well.
Right.
And it really does seem to be the broad perspective, not just of advocates, but the media and politicians as well. So you and I know that real environmentalists come in all political stripes, but how do we kind of get beyond that that perspective that you have to be some kind of socialist in order to care about the environment?
Well, I think people are already beyond that in their daily lives and in their own feelings. It's when they talk about it in terms of public policy that you start to hear people on the center right say, I don't trust this because it is a Trojan horse for socialism. But there's a couple of things to that. First is I work in Washington State, so I deal with a lot of people on the environmental left. And there are certainly those on the environmental left for whom it is just a Trojan horse for socialism and sort of, a proxy. But there are a lot of people on the left who are very frustrated that political solutions aren't working. And for a long time, they just didn't feel like they had an alternative. And now they do feel like there's some innovation and some things that they can do. And so those folks are very sincere environmentalists. They get frustrated when we don't get the outcomes that we want, when we don't help the environment. They don't just sort of pass a law and then walk away and pat themselves on the back. So the first thing I would say is that it may not seem like it, but there's actually a lot of allies on the left, on the environmental left, who have the same frustrations that public policy and politics are getting in the way of true environmental results. On the right, if the choice about the environment is either go with what the left wants, which is these very big government policies, or nothing, a lot of people in the middle are going to go with the environment. So you need to give them an alternative. And if we can empower individuals rather than politicians, that takes away that power. That takes away the incentive, because what the politicians like to say is only we can solve it. You need to just give us the power and give us the money and go away. And that's attractive to some people because, then they feel like, oh, I've done my job. I'm awesome because I voted for this thing and gave all this power to government. The only way to fight that is to give people an alternative and to put power in the hands of individuals. And I know this works because, and the thing that started getting me to think about this, in Seattle, when Uber was first starting, the Seattle city government, which is socialist, is not an exaggeration, they call themselves that, was trying to rein in Uber and put some caps on the number of Uber drivers there could be. 2 weeks later, after they passed that ordinance, there were so many people in the city council chambers that they overrode it, that they changed direction. Now, that is the power that when you put power in the hands of individuals, they don't want to give it back because they see the benefit it makes in their lives. But if you outsource environmentalism, and if your message is we need to outsource environmentalism to politicians, well, then it's going to go a lot of directions that we don't want.
All right, so let's get to some of the solutions that you put into your book. Now, I guess I will only clarify that you talk about technology, and there are multiple strains. I don't pretend to know all the strains in the environmental movement, but there are some who are techno-optimists, and then there are technophobes, if you will, or Luddites. I don't know. I take it you are in the pro-technology based on your title alone, that you are pro-technology. Talk about why that's important, and kind of let's use that as the entree into what you're getting to say in your book.
Yeah, so I think there's two angles of being pro-technology. The one that you hear most common in the environment is things like, I'm pro-nuclear, I'm pro-fusion, right? These very big, sort of grand scale technologies that we put a lot of effort in, and we hope that someday they will pay off, modular nuclear. So when you see articles in the paper about environmental technology, that's often what you get. And then you get, Congress spending lots and lots of money to subsidize those technologies, or give to national labs to come up with new technologies, things like that. I think those things are valuable, obviously, but it's still it still has sort of a very big government angle in a lot of ways, which is that government is choosing, here are the big technologies that are going to solve the problem. Oftentimes, not surprisingly, they're not very good at choosing those technologies. The technology that I think is underrated, and that's why I wrote this book, is small technologies, empowering individuals to do small things that aggregate into big results. And I'll just give you a very simple example. In California, they have a big fight about energy and, installing more grid scale batteries and wind and solar and all these things. Very big fight about the future of energy. But last September, not surprisingly, they were facing an energy shortage, and there was going to be blackouts because it was a hot day. And so they did something they had never done before, which is they sent out a text to residential customers saying, we're facing shortages. Please conserve where you can. And within 15 minutes, the people of California who received that text had reduced electricity demand by 2,000 megawatts, which was equivalent to about the amount of battery power that they had just been using a little bit earlier. So think about that. Think of all the billions of dollars they've spent on grid scale batteries, and one text was able to achieve that same level within 15 minutes and basically avoid the blackouts. That gives you a sense of the power that people have in their hands to do really incredible things without having to have this sort of big government oversight. It's voluntary, and yet everybody who did that saved a little money and then, maybe kept their lights on. That's, I think, the real opportunity that we have, and something as simple as a text being able to change, sort of how we use energy in a dramatic way over a short period of time, I think gives us the potential of what we can achieve.
And that's kind of like a retro version, if you will, of the smart grid. I mean, that, not to deviate too far from the task at hand here, but
Yeah.
the idea of the smart grid has there's certainly a lot of people on the privacy side and who are concerned about the way a smart grid. And I had to program. We have this program here, P&M, during the summer. If you give them the opportunity, you put a box on your AC unit, and if the temperature gets really high, then they can step in and
Right.
essentially control your electricity to a certain extent in order to help keep the lights on across the grid.
And they offer you some inducement.
Yeah, some inducement.
Yeah,
it's $25 or something like
Yeah.
that. We eventually dropped that because it got quite hot. But I realized that's kind of, you're more voluntary, what you're talking about. You're just
Right.
saying, let people know, as opposed to force them, or even induce them and then force them, I guess. So yeah, okay, you can talk about that.
I think that's a good example because, again, you chose to do it. And when you said, you know what, I don't like this, this is too hot, you could turn it off. I think that's great. And I think those opportunities are there because the way electricity rates are structured is that they build in all those costs. They build in the cost of having to do backups. They build in the cost of having lots of demand during peak hours, which is very expensive for them to purchase on wholesale. But consumers don't see that. It's not like, gas stations where exactly the price. If I ask somebody what a kilowatt hour costs, they wouldn't know what it costs, and they wouldn't know what a kilowatt hour is. And yet they're being charged for it. And so what I think things like that do, and other technologies that allow people to see the costs and how they're using technology, is that they can find ways to conserve, cut their bills, but they have more control. It's not that government agencies are deciding, here's how, we're going to charge you based on our agenda. And I think that transparency does another thing, which is it makes it harder for politicians to do nefarious things. Because when gas taxes go up, everybody knows. You see it, right? You see the impact of it. You feel it. You're attuned to it. When we do regulation, when we change the price of electricity and things like that, people don't know. It's hard to discern because they get a bill once a month or once every other month. And so the transparency in and of itself, I think, is very powerful. So some people will decide, I don't like this. I don't like the utility, controlling my thermostat essentially. But I do think that if we're ever going to get to the point where government can't sort of make decisions that we don't know about and then just sort of shrug their shoulders, we're going to need more of that exact kind of transparency.
All right. So let's talk about what are some of the most exciting approaches that you outline in your book that you think are either impacting things right now in a positive direction or that could in the next few years.
Yeah, so we started off by saying, that the technologies be in the U.S. and potentially the globe. So we've just talked a little bit about U.S. energy policy a little bit and getting consumers in the game. But several of my favorite examples are actually overseas for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of the problems are there because people in the United States, their reflex is to say, well, why don't we have a regulation? That's simply not possible in lots of parts of the world. So environmental folks who are concerned about environmental impacts, they can't even go to the government. They have to innovate. And what these show is, and the second thing is, because there are low barriers, some of the coolest innovations are occurring there. But I'll give you one of my favorite examples. So whatever you think about climate change, everybody likes to talk about climate change. Let's talk about ocean plastic. People don't want plastic. They don't want trash in the ocean because they know that it lasts a long time, that it's pollution, that it does bad things. So how do you deal with that? The vast majority of plastic pollution is not coming from the United States. Sri Lanka, this little tiny island country off of India, puts about 4 to 5 times as much plastic into the ocean as the entire United States. So how do you address a problem that's coming from places like Philippines, Sri Lanka, countries that don't have governments that can stop it? So a group called Plastic Bank decided what they were going to do is pay people to pick up plastic, and they would pay them on their phone because a lot of these people don't have bank accounts, but they do have phones. About 90% or more of people in developing countries have some kind of cell phone. So they would pay them that way, and they could tell exactly where the plastic had come from because of GPS and from where they turned it in. And then Plastic Bank took all that plastic, would recycle it, and then sell it to companies like SC Johnson. And so SC Johnson then would turn it into Windex bottles. So if you go to the store, you buy a Windex bottle, it'll say made with ocean-bound plastic. And you know that it's made with ocean-bound plastic because they actually have a web page that shows where the plastic was picked up. So companies are worried about, greenwashing and not getting accused of, doing these things falsely. They actually now have sort of a chain that can go from the Windex bottle basically back to where it was picked up. And this is very simple, right? The technology is not very dramatic. It's basically cell phones. It's a web page. They do use some blockchain to make sure that the accounting is very transparent, but it's not anything novel or difficult. And yet, using that system, they have collected more than 3.1 billion plastic bottles. And the last time I checked, I think it was 160 million pounds of plastic. That's a tremendous amount. Now, that doesn't solve the problem, of course, but it is a huge amount of plastic that would have been in the ocean that is now not in the ocean simply because they created a network, because the technology reduced the barriers of collaboration so that lots of people doing lots of little things could add up to big environmental benefits.
So I might have missed that, but let me, one quick thing. So they're physically going out to the ocean and picking out the plastic?
It's not from the ocean; it's from the beaches. So
okay,
yeah, so it's ocean bound. It's not in the
I
ocean.
See.
So it's an easier problem than collecting it from the ocean. But just to give you a sense of scale, there is a program that is actually building these big nets going out into the Pacific Ocean to try to collect plastic, and then they also have these nets that are on rivers that collect plastic that's going down the rivers. And they call themselves the largest cleanup, the world's largest cleanup. Now, it is a tougher problem. There is no doubt getting the trash from the water than just from a beach. But the last time I checked, which was fairly recently, they had collected 4 million pounds of plastic. So Plastic Bank, with just nothing more than, basically cell phones and people collecting it, 160 million. The world's largest ocean cleanup, 4 million. So again, it's a different type of problem, but I think it is useful to show that you don't need to have big boats and big nets and millions of dollars of, backing to make a really positive impact for the environment.
All right. Well, that is very interesting to hear. Anything else, either international or domestic, share away.
Yeah, I'll give you another, just a small one that it just shows how easy these things are, which is in the capital of Ghana, the lights go out frequently. We talked about smart meters. One of the reasons that people in the United States or utilities put smart meters in is that prior to smart meters, when your power went out, the way your utility knew is if you called. There was no two-way communication. So smart meters, one of the things we did in the United States when we put them in is now they know instantaneously where the power is out. Well, they can't do that in Ghana, right? So the power goes out. They don't have the money to put in the smart meters. So a group of students, I think it was from Berkeley, if it's from Stanford, then I'm really in trouble. But anyway, but they decided they were going to figure out a way to make it so that the utility in the capital could detect if there were outages. And all they did was they put an app on a phone. And the app said, okay, if the phone is charging and it's connected to Wi-Fi, and suddenly it stops charging and is no longer connected to Wi-Fi and doesn't move, right? So if you picked it up and walked out, if it doesn't move, then it sends a ping to the utility. And if all of a sudden the utility gets several pings in one area, they know there's a power outage. Now, all that is an app, right? It's just an app that does a very simple thing, which is check the power, check the Wi-Fi, and see if you're moving. And if it, those three things line up, it sends a signal. Super easy to do. And yet that simple app basically is as effective as installing the smart meters was in the United States. I think that shows how far we've come in technology in just the course. Because we installed the smart meters, in 2000, starting in 2009, a little bit after that, some are still, but, in just a decade, we've gone from where you literally have to install hardware on somebody's wall to now where an app can basically perform one of the major functions.
All right. Well, those are really interesting and unique examples. Internationally, of course, we do live here in the U.S. of A., and I think we all want to know what you think some of the exciting things that can happen here are, or that are happening already.
Well, I talked a little bit about electricity and sort of taking power back from politicians. So it's not just government who is making decisions.
Power by power, you mean political power or electrical power, or both?
Both.
All right.
Right? Taking control of our electricity. Because right now, especially with electricity, it's very opaque, right? The rates are set privately between government and utilities. What the planning is, what gets built. People, are sort of tangentially involved. They have very little idea. The regulations about, okay, how much has to be renewable energy and how much has to be this and that. All of those things are very difficult for people to keep track of, especially when basically all they get is a bill once a month. So getting people more control over that, more transparency, I think is really important. So for instance, right now on my phone, I can tell you exactly how much electricity my home in Washington State is using, and I can tell you what utilities or what appliances rather are on. And the reason is that I put a little box that I purchased in my electrical panel called Sense. And what Sense does is it just looks at the electricity that is coming into my house, and then using artificial intelligence, it looks at the unique electronic signatures of each of my appliances. And then it says, oh, I know what that is. That's your dryer. That's your washing machine. Those are your light bulbs, things like that. And then tells me, here's how you're using your electricity. And it gives you a really good idea of where you can conserve. So in my old house, we had some incandescent light bulbs, and every time I turn it on, I would see my electricity use go way up. And I calculated very quickly that if I just switched to LEDs, that they would basically pay for themselves in a matter of months. So that sort of information allows you to take control. and I'm an energy geek, right? I pay attention to these things, and I was surprised at some of the ways I'm using electricity. So that's something that is out there. It's called the Sense Monitor. I have it. But there are other technologies. Another one, you talked about it sort of with your, the air conditioner, but people can do that with their smart thermostats, and get the same sort of payoff where, if temperatures go up or, and there's too much demand, it can adjust it for you and you get a rebate of some kind. The key thing about all of this is that because the barriers to innovation are so low, you may say, you know what, I don't like that smart thermostat thing. That sounds weird to me. I don't want to do that. Government is good at one size fits all, but people are not one size fits all. And the only way that we are going to address, and the only way we're going to give people true control over environmental issues, energy, and things like that, is to have a diversity of options. And the free market is fantastic at creating that diversity. And because the barriers are so low to innovation now, people can choose technologies or things that they can do that do make them comfortable, that they do feel control of, and yet save them energy. And you don't have to think climate change is an existential crisis. I certainly don't. I think it's real, but I think it's exaggerated. But if I can tell you, look, you're going to save money on this, no matter what you believe, people are going to do that. And that's the way we get beyond political solutions, which is that we give people, it doesn't matter that you are politically aligned with, whatever the policies are. If you're doing it because you save money, because it makes your life easier, that's the way we're going to make environmental policy sustainable in the truest sense of that word, which means that it is sustained over time. It doesn't matter who's in office, right? Once you give people power, as I gave the example of Seattle, they don't want to give it back.
So since I get the impression that is like a nest on steroids, if you will.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay. So it can be used to do many of the same things as you would, like to control the heat and times it comes on and the air conditioning, et cetera. But it also monitors what is using the most.
Primarily, it is about detecting what is in your house and how you're using electricity and helping you find ways. But yes, it can connect with other things. So, for people who have an electric vehicle, one of the things you don't want to charge that electric vehicle at 6 p.m. because that's when the rates are highest. So if you come home, you plug in your EV, you're paying very expensive rates. What you want is to plug in your EV and then have it charge at 2 a.m. when the rates
are you
lowest.
paying? This is maybe it differs by state and jurisdiction, but do most utilities price you differently at different times of the day?
A little bit.
Okay.
Not nearly as much as they pay. And that's what I think is there's sort of a false economy of basically our tariffs were written 150 years ago when electricity first started because people didn't have information.
Sure.
Now people do have literally the ability to check what the electricity rates are, wholesale electricity rates are at any given time. But our tariffs still reflect the fact that people don't have information and they become accustomed to that. So what we need to do is we need to give people more control, more transparency, more knowledge, so that if they want to say, you know what, I want to be rewarded for not charging my car at 6 rather than 2, we need to do that because that brings rates down for everybody. The technology is there to do it. It's very easy. In fact, in the UK, there is a company called Octopus Energy, and they have some wind turbines. And if you join up for what's called their fan club, when that wind turbine is blowing, you get a reduced electricity rate. And when it's really windy, you get an even lower rate. And all it does is it just sends you a signal on your phone. Hey, guess what? Rates are down right now. So that's not difficult, right? All it's doing is sending you a ping on your phone and you can make a decision. But that is, something that only a utility could have done 15 years ago, you now can do just from your phone.
Wow. Very interesting. I have to ask because obviously the technology is there, but regulatory policies may or may not be there, especially when it comes to, and I'm not trying to get too far afield, but this does kind of, I think it both at one point it supports your approach in your thesis, but it also provides a limitation to
Yep.
what can be achieved by individuals acting, because government so often is either dealing with, like you're saying, outdated approaches to pricing of electricity. When you're right, they should be, especially during hot summer days. Now I know Washington, your weather is like on a different in a different realm. It's the exact opposite in some ways as New Mexico. But in the summertime, you're getting that uptick in electricity usage when people are coming home from work and air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. And if the government says you can't charge people any different for that kilowatt hour than the kilowatt hour at 3 a.m., it kind of defeats a lot of potential reform efforts. So sorry to
that's exactly right. And the thing is, the thing I don't like about that is, like I say, it's a false economy. Because if what you're told is, look, it doesn't matter what time of day you use electricity, or there's a slight difference between using it at, say, 3 a.m. and 6 p.m., you still pay for that, because the rates as a whole will move up based on how much demand there is during those peak hours. And so if people say, I can, it's a buffet, I can have as much as I want at 6 p.m., the utilities still have to buy that electricity, the very expensive electricity at wholesale rates. And so that will drive your overall prices up, even if consumers don't see it. So, the way to deal with that is to do what we do already with gas prices, right? This is not a novel concept. Everybody sees gas prices. Everybody is used to dealing and adjusting to gas prices. We can now do that with electricity. We couldn't 15 years ago, which is why the rates are the way they are, which is why the system is. But to the extent that we can shift it so that people have more control, then especially, like I said, when politicians want to play games, either with new regulations, new mandates, new requirements that drive the price up, people are more likely to see that and respond to it, rather than politicians getting away with it because the system is so opaque.
All right. Well, so there's a lot in here, a lot of very useful and practical information that, I'm now going to research one of these sensors, I guess.
Yeah.
We'll just call it that. Monitors. And it's great to encourage people, because you're right. Everybody, whether they consider themselves a really environmentally oriented person, you always care about dollars and cents, of course. And as the parent of 3 children, there was a meme or something, maybe a Babylon Bee article about how dad's number one hobby is walking around the house, turning off lights, and empty rooms, that kind of stuff. I care about all of those things. And you're also helping to save the environment. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of things that, I, like you, am an environmentalist, and I really want to see good done while also not killing our economy. So, of course, we all lived through this pandemic, and, Seattle, I've been to Seattle during rush hour. I've seen the traffic. It's really, really nasty up there. How was that impacted? And I'm getting to the point of, the one of the few, silver linings of COVID was telecommuting and the virtual workforce. And within the context of thinking small, is this something that we, first and foremost, the fact that telecommuting is such a much bigger deal by orders of magnitude, and no one in the environmental movement seems to talk about it.
Yeah.
because it's probably the greatest environmental success story since fracking, which they also don't want to talk about it. Exactly. But anyway, that's part of the problem is like getting people to think rationally rather than emotionally and focused on government. Right. So I know there's a question in there somewhere, but can you just explain some of what talk about there?
There are several good things there. The first is that one of the big problems, as we talked about with my book, Eco Fads, one of the big problems with environmentalism is because it has become an identity. So when people think about identity politics, they think about race or gender or other things like that. But environmentalism is one of those identities. So when you say, hey, the solution to transportation related CO2 emissions is Zoom or telecommuting, if it's not something that somebody can take credit for, it's very hard for them to feel good about it and feel like they have made a difference. When it's your identity, you want to show, look, I'm making a difference. I'm pushing for the right thing. So things that happen organically, spontaneously, where's the fun in that? I didn't force that. That just happened. So I think that makes it difficult to recognize good things that happen, but that people can't take credit for. That's both for activists and politicians. The second thing is that COVID is the perfect example of if you come up with a transportation plan, and we fight, right? We have transportation plans. We love planning in Seattle and Washington State. And so they have all these transportation plans. We're building light rail. We're spending billions and billions of dollars on all these things. And then, we're the home of Microsoft, Amazon, right? We have Google. So lots and lots of very tech savvy people. And guess what they did during COVID? Well, they worked from home and they still want to work from home. So the demand for all of these billions of dollars that we have spent on transportation has been reduced radically. And yet government is still plunging forward as if nothing has changed. And so that, I think, is the problem with these one size fits all solutions is that when things change, you're stuck on a path. And again, getting back to the diversity of solutions that markets can provide. I have a chapter in my book about transportation, about all of the options. And one of the coolest actually started in Canada. It's a group called Pentonium. And what they did is they started working with bus companies, transit agencies, to create on-demand bus routes. So it's sort of like an Uber. You say, look, here's where I am. Here's where I need to go. Here's what time I need to be there. And then the bus would say, okay, we're going to meet you, at this basically bus stop. They have some stops at this time. And so you'd go, and then other people would get along, and it would dynamically create a bus route. And that got people there on time faster. It was more guaranteed. And it actually reduced the amount of gasoline and therefore CO2 emissions that the agency used, because they could say, well, we don't need to go on this whole side route of our usual bus route. We can cut that off because we're going a shorter route.
So this was still a government operated agency.
Correct.
Then. Okay, but they still better.
But they used the technology. So rather than just static routes, they had dynamic routes using technology. And what they did is they saved gasoline, and they tripled their ridership, because now you can tell people, look, we're going to actually get you where you want to go when you want to get there. And so that's one example of a public sector solution. Well, I was just in Phoenix. They have driverless taxis.
Right.
So that's another option. So, but again, not any one of those is going to work for everybody. It's the diversity that makes it work.
And it's called Pentonium?
Pentonium is the name of the company, yeah.
All right. Well, our bus system in Albuquerque, as Wally and I were talking about it at the end of a previous podcast, where we were talking about the fact that the Albuquerque buses have gone downhill and ridership has gone downhill. And it definitely seems like they could do a much better job, and maybe that's something to consider. So I'll have to take a look at that one. Finally, and we've got very limited time, this is mostly just a pet peeve / question of mine on environmental issues. So we have in Albuquerque these big blue bins where you put all your stuff in, your recycling. And you did at the outset talk about plastic pollution in the oceans, and it's been fairly well documented, although not well publicized, that one of the great sources of ocean plastic is that the U.S. would ship over to China in particular plastic for ostensible recycling that was not recycled, and it wound up in the water. Now, what I'm going to say is that, again, I wish that market forces were relevant to government entities. I was at a NBA basketball game up in Denver, and it's called Ball Arena now, which Ball Arena is the can manufacturing company. And so they were extremely proactive about recycling aluminum cans. And of course, aluminum has a price associated with it.
Yep.
And you know it's worth recycling if they'll pay you for it.
Yep.
So is there anything out there in terms of maybe more innovative than just bottle bills or whatever for encouraging people to recycle the things that are actually recyclable and have a market for it, and not worry so much about stuff that's really unlikely to get recycled at the end of the day?
This is a really interesting issue because recycling is going through a big change right now for exactly the reason you said, which is that China stopped taking our recyclables because too much of it was trash and not recyclable. And so we were basically dumping it on them.
Because we weren't separating our stuff well enough, which it's darn near impossible to separate it like, to their desire.
So now we have to, so we're going through this change. So there's some interesting things. The first thing I always say at the outset is, I agree with and understand the desire not to put things in a landfill, right? If something can be reused efficiently, then we should reuse it. Those things are valuable, right? Those things are resources. But we have a lot of landfill space. If we don't add any landfill space, we probably won't have to add, we'll be fine through like 2100, I think, was the last estimate. So a very, very long time. So I think people get more concerned about trash than they should. I understand why it's good, but it's not as big a concern as some people say. Now, that being said, right, if you can give somebody a can, aluminum can is valuable, right? It's recyclable, and they will pay you for it, right? As a kid, that was how kids my age made money, is we would gather aluminum cans and we would go turn them in and we would get paid for them. But glass, I mean, it's essentially worthless. So there is actually a variety of things going on to try to create a domestic recycling industry to make up for what we lost in China. But part of that is innovation. So there was a recycling plant up in Seattle that I took a tour of several years back, and they basically have a conveyor belt. And what that conveyor belt, they pour everything on the conveyor belt, and the first thing does is like it separates the cardboard boxes, and everything else goes through. And then it goes to the next thing, and they separate the cans, and the next thing goes through. And so each step of the way, they separate out one of the recyclables, and then anything that's not recyclable ends up in a trash heap, and that is the trash at the end. Now, it's not perfect, and there's a lot of ways to go, but we're starting to get to the point where technology can do that sorting for us effectively. And one of the highest costs, one of the reasons that recycling costs so much is the sorting. And to the extent that you can automate that, well, then the value of those recyclables starts to come through and the cost of processing starts to go down.
Wow. Well, I pulled a few of those questions out of left field, and you didn't disappoint. Thank you very much, Todd. Again, the book is Time to Think Small, How Nimble Environmental Technologies Can Solve the Planet's Biggest Problems. He's also speaking at a luncheon this week, Wednesday, the 5th.
Yeah, and just to add one quick thing.
Sure.
One of the things that I tell people, especially on the center right about my book, is that the foreword is written by a woman named Talia Speaker, who's a wildlife biologist who works for a group called Wild Labs, which is part of the World Wildlife Fund. And so there is a lot of bipartisan, a lot of, across the political spectrum support for these types of approaches. So I think a lot of us have kids, family members, other folks who are on the left who've heard, about environmental concerns, and they're wondering sort of how to get them to look at these things in a different way that isn't just big government. And that's part of why I wrote my book, is because I think that there is broad appeal for these types of ideas.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time and coming out to New Mexico to share your information with us and give me some new ideas, because these are things that I like to try to implement myself. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.